Essentially, this discussion is generally not one that we will dwell on in a class of Tanya for ladies, but the message is part of the theme of Tanya. So we'll go through it somewhat on a more, superficial level than what we have done with the other subjects. We're coming from a place in the Tanya where the Alter Rebbe is describing what happens when a person transgresses a law of Torah. Hashem has given us life in the form of a soul. Hashem has given us a beautiful world with opportunities in the forms of all the things that we will encounter in our day-to-day life, the things that we own, the things that we have opportunity to use. If and when we use them in the service of Hashem, we reveal in them the holiness and thereby strip away the falsehood, the illusion of independence that the world loves to maintain. We reveal that everything is a piece of Hashem, and thereby we are elevating the soul, which means the spiritual life force that's in that object. And we are creating a bond between Hashem and that object. That's the good news when you fulfill a mitzvah. When you observe a prohibition, that means you do not use a forbidden object, or you do not use a permitted object in a forbidden manner. Again, you are preserving, even if you're not creating, but you're preserving the health and well-being of whatever progress you were able to make, or we as the Jewish people, or we as the human race in general are able to make, in terms of piece by piece, slowly removing this illusion from the world, this illusion that the world loves to hang on to and loves to nurture, and that it is apart from Hashem, that it's separate, that it exists on its own without any help. That's called unholy, that's called klipa. So last week and the week before, we discussed what happens if a person does in fact use something in an inappropriate manner. So we spoke about parav things whose life force is not innately, automatically chained to unholiness. If you use it in a proper way, it's easily bonded and connected to Hashem. If you use it in an inappropriate way, well, the life force of that object becomes captured in the forces of unholiness until the person will turn it around, do tshuva, begin to observe, first of all, apologize and confess, but then turn around their behavior and return to Hashem so mightily that they are carried, that the lost sparks of our own misbehavior are carried upwards into a new relationship, a refreshed relationship with Hashem along with us. That is if it is used in a forbidden manner. If we were just greedy when we were using permitted things, then as soon as we stop being greedy, we don't even have to do tshuva for that. For the duration of our greed, the life force of the permitted object falls into the hands of unholiness, because the object was used not for God's purpose, but for our own human purpose, indulgence and so on. When we stop indulging and we start serving Hashem again with the energy of that food or whatever, then automatically the life force of that object is elevated. So we have essentially two camps. We have the camp of permitted objects that are used in a greedy way, but not necessarily a forbidden way. And you have things that are forbidden to use and you use them, or they are permitted to use, but you use them in a sinful way, in a forbidden way. Greed, we said, is easily repaired. But sinful behavior is much more difficult. And as the Alter Rebbe explained, we read it in the previous class, you really need a tremendous effort and a tremendous help from Hashem to transform the life force of that object back to have it revert to holiness. It's a tremendous effort. All of this, is not even to mention your own life energy that you put into that activity, which also can be captured in the hands of unholiness. And we discussed ways to release the life of your own soul that has fallen into unholiness because of misbehavior. Now, the Alter Rebbe points out, to close up this chapter, the Alter Rebbe points out some exceptions to the principles that were laid out in the last two classes, which means parts 2 and 3 of this chapter 7. One example is a sin which is performed using a permissible act and permissible objects, permitted objects and permitted act, but it was done not in a greedy way, which we discussed earlier, but in a forbidden way. Right? We're talking about using human seed in a forbidden way. There are two options. One option is to spill the seed and waste it, like we learned from the sons of Yehuda in the Chumash. The sons of Yehuda were executed by Hashem for spilling their seed on the floor. It's forbidden from Torah. That means that Torah forbids the wasting of human seed, which is potential life. That's one level. The other level is to engage in a forbidden relationship. If a person is intimate with a forbidden partner, someone that the Torah says you're not allowed, and human offspring is born from that, that is also a very, very unique situation in terms of how you can repair it, whether or not you can repair it. That is the subject for today. And you can understand, of course, why. We will go through pretty much on a surface level, and we'll take whatever lessons we can take, and we'll move on. Says the Alter Rebbe in the Tanya, as opposed to the principles that we said previously, that when you use something, when you use a permitted object out of greed, it's very easy to redeem the object and the holiness and bring it back up into the camp of Kedusha. Whereas if you do something that's forbidden, it's very hard. Here's an exception to the rule. Hachayus, the vitality, the divine energy that animates tipos zera, drops of seed, sheyatzu mimenu levatol, that were wasted by a human being, which essentially those drops of seed are permitted, they're permissible, they're parav, it's klipas noiga. But because they were wasted, which is something the Torah says you're not allowed, so therefore, as they fell down and became included into the 3 completely impure klippas as a result of being used in a forbidden way, unlike all other absolutely forbidden activities, this one, it's easy to redeem the energy that's invested in those seeds. All you need is proper tshuva. And another thing, bechavono atzuma b'kriyas shma she'al hamita kanoida meharizal. This is something that Kabbalah emphasizes very, very strongly, that wasting seed, which in halacha and in Kabbalah it's called desecrating the covenant, desecrating the bris. can be repaired, especially and particularly through reciting Kriya Shema at bedtime, the bedtime Shema, with tremendous intention and tremendous devotion and tremendous concentration, kavanah. What happens? Umenubaz b'Gemara, it's not only a mystical idea, it's also a Talmudic idea hinted to in the Gemara, where it says, Kol ha'koyre Kriya Shema al mitosei, a person who reads Shema at bedtime, ke'ilu oiches cherev shel shtei piyos, as though he is holding a sword with two edges. Laharege gufos hachitzonim shenasu levush lechayos shabatipos, to execute, to slay the forces of unholiness that have taken hold of the life force that is in those human seeds. Once those demons are slain, have been executed, then the holiness can be redeemed and rise up from them. Those that are studying Kabbalah, familiar with Kabbalah, if you watch any of the YouTube Kabbalah rabbis, you hear this theme over and over and over, that tikkun habris, the rectification, correcting the covenant that was damaged by the spilling of human seed, is done through the careful recitation of Kriyas Shema. And the careful recitation of Kriyas Shema is a good way to solve a lot of spiritual problems, many spiritual problems. In fact, in the lifestyle of Hasidim, the bedtime Shema is critical. Some examples. There's a story about Rabbi Itche Masmid. Rabbi Itche Masmid, last name is really Horowitz. He was a Levi from the tribe of Levi. And he was traveling one time. He used to raise funds for the previous Rebbe. He was traveling one time and he came to an inn, and the innkeeper offered to prepare for some food for him. And Rabbi Itche says, I really don't want to eat now. I'm so tired. I just want to go to sleep. Okay, so the innkeeper showed him to a nice room, and he came by an hour later expecting that Rabbi Itche would be fast asleep. And he sees there's still light shining in that room. He came back a few hours later, still the light's on, shining in that room. It was only in the early hours of the morning that finally the light went out in that room where Rabbi Itche was staying. So in the morning, the innkeeper says to him, Rabbi Itche, I don't understand. I offered you food. You said you're so tired, you don't even want to eat. But then all through the night, the light was burning in your room. So Rabbi Itche says, true, I was very tired, but a Jew has to say the bedtime Shema, which means that if we're understanding him correctly, all of those hours from when he entered his room till the light finally went out were spent on his bedtime Shema. Why does the bedtime Shema have to take such a long time? So there's another story. This one is an experience that my great-grandfather, Rabbi Yochanan Gordon, it's my mother's grandfather, had with the Rebbe. So there was a tzedakah institution under the leadership of the previous Rebbe called Shomrei Shabbos, and it was tzedakah for poor families to help them with their needs weekly. And my great-grandfather, Rabbi Yochanan Gordon, was the gabbai. He was the administrator of that charity fund. And it was his duty, among his responsibilities, was to bring a report to the previous Rebbe every year about how much money had been brought in fundraising, how much money had been borrowed, and how much money had been repaid. And each year he would show the previous Rebbe, and the previous Rebbe would have a lot of nachas from this. In the first year of our Rebbe's leadership, Rabbi Yochanan noticed that the returns had been very, very good. That means a lot of people were repaying the loans, and the fund had a lot of money in it. So he was very excited. It made him very happy to know that he could give more loans now. And he was expecting that the Rebbe also should express pleasure in how well the fund was being managed and how successful, how much potential the fund had. So he shows the Rebbe this report, and the Rebbe says to him, Yochanan, you couldn't do more? Just the Rebbe's way. Well, the Rebbe says, Rabbi Yochanan, it's always possible to do more. Because he saw, the Rebbe saw that Rabbi Yochanan was expecting a compliment, and he was a little taken aback that he hadn't gotten one. So therefore the Rebbe is explaining, it's always possible to do more. Each night, the Rebbe explains, the Rebbe shares a personal, or an insight into his personal life, which is very, very rare. The Rebbe says each night at the bed, during the bedtime Shema, before we go to sleep, we all say Shema Yisrael, but along with the recitation of the Shema Yisrael, we also make a calculation. We do a review of our day. That's something that's very important in the life of Hasidim. What did I accomplish today? What was I expected to accomplish today that I was not able to? What did I do wrong today that I have to fix? And of course, what can I do to make tomorrow better? This is the Rebbe saying about himself. This is his process. That's why Kriyas Shema can take so very, very long. They say about real Hasidim. Real Hasidim can give you a report about every thought that they thought for years and years, decades. They have it calculated, registered in their memories, those thoughts that need to be corrected, and they work on them constantly to correct them. Kriyas Shema done properly is something that's very, very special, very, very precious. There's a saying from Reb Mendel Vitebsker. Mendel Vitebsker for a short while was the Rebbe of the Alter Rebbe. Very holy Jew, a big tzaddik, a Rebbe. And he says, he was getting on in years, and he said once, with what will I enter, or with what will I appear before the heavenly court? What can I bring with me? What do I have that's valuable? And he said, nothing other than the bedtime Shema. And Hasidim explained, what does that mean? That's the only valuable thing the big tzaddik has to his credit. And they explained that all other mitzvahs could somehow have some kind of personal benefit to them. Krishma Shalamita, the bedtime Shema, whose main program is to review your behavior, is something that there's no pleasure. It's just real hard work. It's the real work of serving Hashem. That being said, the Rebbe Rashab once heard one of the boys in his brand new yeshiva called Temchei Temimim. The Rebbe Rashab founded and built that yeshiva. The Rebbe Rashab heard one of the boys reading the bedtime Shema out loud with tremendous emotion and concentration and weeping. The next day, the Rebbe called that young man and scolded him and said, how is it possible that when you're reading the bedtime Shema, I have to hear your voice? Can't you hide yourself in your room somewhere and whisper it quietly so nobody should hear you? In other words, the bedtime Shema is a really honest, private event. If there's any showiness about it, then some of its quality is lost. The Tzemach Tzedek the Rebbe Maharash provided for each of his children a secretary, a caretaker, to help them with all of their needs, being that the Rebbe is often very busy and doesn't have enough time to deal with bedtime and all that stuff. The attendant that was assigned to the young boy who would eventually grow up to be the Rebbe Rashab reports that at Kriyas Shema for the bedtime, at the bedtime Kriyas Shema, the Rebbe Rashab would become so agitated at what he perceived as lack of progress or insufficiencies, that he would weep intensely, and even sometimes it was so intense that the attendant himself tore his clothes from the great distress. That's a story that I can't say that I understand completely, but you see the effect. The attendant was able to witness what a young Rebbe looks like when he says Shema, and the impact it had on the other guy, on the attendant himself, was so profound that it caused him to do a tremendous tshuva. Tearing the clothing generally is a sign of tshuva. That's how I understand the story. It may not be correct. Well, let's go back to the science of this parsha, the science of this story. Because spilling seed is in a category of its own, lochein, therefore, lo yehuzkar avoin zer levatol b'Torah bechlal biyos asures. That's why spilling seed is not listed among the forbidden relations, because the science behind it, the mystical mechanisms behind it, is very, very different than a forbidden relation. Af shechomor mehem, even though in a certain respect, spilling seed on the floor is worse than a forbidden relationship, an illicit relationship. V'gadol avoinoi mibchinas hagadlus v'ribei hatuma v'haklipa is shamoili du marbe mim'oid ma'oid b'hoitza zer levatala yeser b'bies asures. In which respect is spilling the seed on the floor worse than a forbidden relationship? In that, because, well, first we'll translate the Alter Rebbe's words, that there is an enormity and abundance of impurity, and an enormity and abundance of klipos being developed as a result of that act. The person begets and multiplies them to an exceedingly great extent through the wasteful emission of seed, even more so than through forbidden relations. Why? Because since there is no vessel receiving this energy, the energy is allowed to proliferate with hardly any limit. In a forbidden relation, there is a vessel that receives the energy, and then the energy can only spread within the vessel. That is its limitation. Where there is no vessel, the unholiness can rise and fly around and impact very, very deeply into the camp of holiness, even all the way till the mind, the consciousness of holiness. And that's one of the most important reasons why the wasteful spilling of seed is considered such a dangerous sin and such a damaging sin, because its impact reaches even to the consciousness of the person and the mind, the proverbial mind of the whole process of creation. Keep this in mind, because this is very important. Since there is no vessel, so the unholiness that is the product of this sin is like a free radical. It could go anywhere, could attach itself to anything. That makes it very dangerous, but it also makes it very easy, or easier to rectify. Maybe not easy, not very easy, but easier to rectify than the usual forbidden activity. How so? Since there is nothing containing it and holding onto it on the side of unholiness, there is no anchor binding it to the side of unholiness with great strength. Therefore, when a person will do a proper tshuva, which the Alter Rebbe will describe in detail in the section called Letters of Tshuva, proper tshuva for this sin is enough to redeem the sparks, the holiness, the life force that has now been held captive or taken captive in unholiness. Let's compare this. I know this is a little confusing even as I'm saying it. I hear that it's a little confusing. So let's clarify. What are we comparing this to? We said yesterday that if a person commits a forbidden act, the energy of that forbidden act is lost to unholiness till Mashiach comes. The only way to save those sparks is to do such a tremendous tshuva that the sins themselves become mitzvahs. The Alter Rebbe is saying, in this case of a wasteful emission, you don't have to do a tshuva to that degree. A moderate degree of tshuva can also help. Why? Since there is no vessel that received that unholiness on the part, there was no representative on the part of unholiness that received that, the energy of that act, leaving that energy and the klipa and the unholiness that is the result of that act as free radicals roaming around the whole process of creation, wreaking havoc and making everything impure. Okay, that's the danger of it. The upside is that it's easier to redeem it. A moderate amount of tshuva, a moderate level of tshuva can quickly redeem that holiness, those sparks. What about a forbidden relationship? Then on the other hand, if a person is engaging in forbidden relations, then because there is a recipient, there is a vessel to receive the life force that is being donated to the forces of unholiness, that life force can be processed more efficiently and more life is added to the unholiness. Not just more free radicals in unholiness, but actually more life energy is provided, more sustenance is provided to the forces of unholiness, and that energy and life force is better integrated and more properly digested by unholiness, and therefore it's much harder to redeem, to save, and to release that life force from the grasp of unholiness. Unless, as we said, he does tshuva from tremendous, boundless love to the point that zdainis nasa, like his zechuyos, to the point where his sins itself becomes a mitzvah. Now, there is a note to clarify one point. Since the sin of wasting seed can be rectified even without the tremendous highest level of tshuva, called tshuva me'ahava rabba, tshuva from tremendous, outstanding love for Hashem. Therefore, the Torah does not include this sin in the category of forbidden relations. Forbidden relations can only be fixed through this tremendous tshuva me'ahava rabba. In this footnote, the Alter Rebbe will explain the science. I went through it in English briefly. Here, the Alter Rebbe will explain it in his own, in his words. Why is it that the wasteful emission of seed is easily redeemed? Mipnei, that's because why is it that a forbidden relation is harder to release and harder to redeem, harder to save the life force and holiness from that than when one spilled seed in a sinful manner? Because when a person is involved in a relationship with another human being in a sinful manner, then the spiritual mirrors the physical, because in the physical there is a vessel, there's a recipient. So too in the spiritual there is a recipient. There's the giver and the receiver. Because it's being received within the physical female, then so too on the part of klipa, in the spiritual sense, there is a vessel to receive that energy, and it becomes fully integrated within the realm of unholiness. Let's read it in Hebrew. Sorry. There is a level of unholiness whose job is to receive life from holiness and integrate it into the world of unholiness, called nukva of klipa. Whereas in the case of spilling seed, wasting it on the floor, there is no vessel in the human sense, and there's also no parallel vessel in the spiritual sense, meaning the nukva of klipa is not active. No one is receiving it on the part of the klipa to integrate it properly into the world of unholiness. The closest the unholiness can get is that for the duration of that act, and as a result of the seeds that have been spilled on the floor and wasted, and the energy that has been invested from the person and from Hashem in that seed, all the klipa can do is embrace it. It cannot really adopt it or integrate it into unholiness. And this, of course, also, Kaiduli Dechein, is a vast discussion in Kabbalah, and it's known to those that are students of Kabbalah. And here we come to the ultimate irredeemable sin. The ultimate irredeemable sin goes like this. Through this, we can understand the teaching of the Chachamim. What is a sin that cannot be fixed, that cannot be rectified? If a person has, God forbid, engaged in relations with a person whom the Torah says that they are not allowed to be with, and in addition to the act, and in addition to the nourishment that they provided for the realm of unholiness, for the powers and forces of Klippa, they actually had a physical child from that relationship. This is what the Chachamim attribute to the verse, that is a mistake that cannot be fixed. Why? Sha'az, because in that case, not only Gam im yasa tshuva gedola kol kach, he could do the greatest amount of tshuva, the highest level of tshuva, and he could redeem his person, and he could redeem perhaps some of the holiness that was captured in the casings in the realm of unholiness, but he cannot free all of it. Why? Because that life, that vitality cannot be brought up to holiness, because there's already a physical manifestation of evil's control, evil's dominion over that energy, because that energy has been clothed in a physical body. And that cannot be fixed through tshuva. No amount of tshuva can fix that. There is a story, a famous story, a well-known story, but it's relevant here. Rabbi Yosef Weinberg shares this story when he's teaching a Tanya on the radio. Rabbi Yosef Weinberg was a great teacher of Tanya. He's the one that actually composed Lessons in Tanya as the, our favorite lesson. The book Lessons in Tanya is actually his notes, his preparation notes for his radio Tanya class, and that's actually what we're using on the screen is Lessons in Tanya from Rabbi Yosef Weinberg, translated by his son, who's a shliach in Missouri. Yeah, he shares this story. There was a scholar and a Rav named Rabbi Yosef of Beshenkovich. He was a young man, blessed with tremendous talents, fear of heaven, and a great mind. He became close to the Alter Rebbe, and he served for his livelihood as a teacher of students, of young children. One time he came for a private meeting with the Alter Rebbe called Yechidus, And the Alter Rebbe asked him if he is fluent in the Mishnah, if he knew Mishnayos by heart. When he told the Alter Rebbe that he was fluent in Mishnayos by heart, the Alter Rebbe told him Mishnah has the same letters as the word neshama. Marry a lady and have children, and Hashem will bless you that you'll have long life. And then the Alter Rebbe added, for the benefit of your soul, you should become a wagon driver as opposed to a rabbi. So he married, and when they offered him positions as a rabbi in various cities, he remembered always the Alter Rebbe's instructions. And after several attempts, he finally was able to train himself to manage a horse and cart and become a wagon driver. Once, in the days between Pesach and Shavuos, he was traveling on the road towards a town called Senna. Towards evening, he came to a hotel, and in that hotel, a Jew was staying there by the name of Shlomo Leib. This Shlomo Leib had already left the path of Judaism, of Yiddishkeit. He had married a lady that was not Jewish, and they had had children together. Those children are not Jewish. When Rabbi Yosef, the wagon driver, had rested a little bit, he woke up at midnight to recite the traditional Tikkun Chatzos, lamentations, which pious people, holy people, and in the old days, all people would wake up at midnight and recite or mourn and bemoan the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. And this Rabbi Yosef Balagola, Rabbi Yosef Bashenkovich, he woke up at midnight and he was reciting the Tikkun Chatzos as he did every night. And it's with great pain, he was mourning the destruction of Beis HaMikdash and praying for the arrival of Mashiach, and the sound of his prayers, the sound of his voice reciting the Tikkun Chatzos affected this Reb Shlomo Leib so deeply that he started to think, what have I done? What have I done to myself? I left the path of Yiddishkeit. I adopted a non-Jewish wife and her children. So in the morning, he asked this wagon driver if he could please borrow his talis and tefillin. He hadn't davened in talis and tefillin in years, and he davened that morning with talis and tefillin with tremendous weeping and a lot of tears. That day, Reb Shlomo Leib fell very ill that same day, and he was very, very dangerous situation for him. When he finally awoke, he told Rabbi Yosef that he had made a decision that he's going to do a complete and absolute tshuva. He's going to return to his Jewish wife and children. And Rabbi Yosef starts to calm him. Yeah, I say. Shlomo Leib became very excited, and he wept with great bitterness over the fact that he had committed a sin, a crime for which there was no cure. He had produced children, his own children, with a lady that's not Jewish. He says that only death with great suffering can atone for this sin. He says, I am happy, I'm willing and ready to accept the greatest suffering, no matter what, so long as he can return completely and be freed of any of the impurities that his decisions in life recently had caused. Well, a few days go by, and Shlomo Leib is in bed with a terrible fever, and he's hovering between life and death. And those that are surrounding him nearby, they had some terrible news for him. and they kept it from him, they hid the news from him because of his terrible health, then they didn't want to disturb him anymore or cause him any more distress, lest it cost him his life. But what happened was that his family, the non-Jewish family that he had with him in that city, they had gone for a ride, and they had gone on a bridge, and the bridge had collapsed, and they had fallen into the water. And unfortunately, they had all been lost in the river. When Rabbi Yosef Beshenkovich, the wagon driver, heard about this news, he went personally into the room of Rabbi Shlomo Leib, and he lifted the head of the patient, and he whispered to him in his ear that his wife and his non-Jewish children had drowned. Rahman al-Islam. So the upside of the story is that now he was free to return to his Jewish wife and children. And he had to repeat this message several times in the ear of the patient until the patient would finally register it in his mind, and he opened up his eyes. When he opened his eyes, Rabbi Yosef told him again what happened to his non-Jewish family. And he says that because his eyes are open and he's conscious and the sun had not yet set, he could still put on tefillin that day. After several days, Shlomo Leib was well enough. He traveled to Vitebsk, and Rabbi Yosef went back to his home in Beshenkovich. When he came home, he found many Hasidim had prepared themselves to travel in a group to the Mittler Rebbe in Lubavitch, and he made a decision to go with them. One day, this is what Rabbi Yosef is telling, he's recounting his own memories. I was walking in the streets of Lubavitch, and I met this Shlomo Leib, walking also in the streets with one of the young Hasidim. He recognized me very quickly, right away, was very happy to see me, and he told me that he had been offered a position to travel on behalf of some official to do business in Ukraine. And we'll just skip to the end of the story if you don't mind. The end of the story is that finally, when this Rabbi Yosef, the wagon driver, was accepted into a private meeting with the Mittler Rebbe, which is the second Rebbe of Lubavitch, the son of the Alter Rebbe, the Mittler Rebbe told him, my father turned you from a Rav into a wagon driver, and I'm going to turn you from a wagon driver into a Rav. And he said, you have to go take a position as a rabbi in a city somewhere. And that's what he did. He sold his horse and his wagon, and he became a great mashpia for the Hasidim. Well, that's the story. Unfortunately,
I think you left out the juicy part. You left out the part that made it have meaning.
What's the juicy part?
I don't know. You said you skipped to the end.
Well, not the juicy part. I just left out the part about what happens to Shlomo Leib later in his life, which is
okay.
The main part of the story is how terribly painful correcting this last category of sin is. If a person has a child with somebody that is forbidden to them, only death and dying and suffering can correct that sin. There's no other way around it. And but we're not saying that not as a punishment. In Torah, there's no punishment. There's only consequence, the result of your actions. The result of this act of engaging in relations with a person whom Torah says you're forbidden to engage in relations with, and having a child from that relationship, the only correction is awful and terrible and painful. That's why the Chachamim call it Me'uvas lo yuchal lisken. It's a sin that cannot be fixed, because nothing you can do can fix it. The person himself cannot murder the child that was the product of his or her indiscretion. And so there is no, all you can do is tshuva, 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 and hope that somehow Hashem in His mercy will assist you in rectifying that sin. But it's very, very painful. Okay, what we have accomplished so far is to become very, very familiar with the inner workings of the soul and to become somewhat familiar with the inner workings of the world, how holiness and unholiness interact with each other. And we will spend one more chapter, Mitzvah Hashem, on that subject, and then we will turn, excuse me, and then we will turn to the subject of how you actually use this information in the service of Hashem. Thank you for joining. Have a wonderful Chanukah.